Okay. Again, my name is Bill Tro, and I am the project manager from SRF that is helping everybody put together the safety action plan. Today is going to be the kind of the, well, to a certain extent, you can think about it as a big data dump, but then also kind of giving an explanation of how the activities that we've been doing all come together and essentially work together to help us understand where our high priority network for addressing crashes within each of the 7 communities is going to be located. So I'm going to share. How about if we start off here with, if you could, just put your name and which community you're with in the chat, and we can go about kind of understanding who all is here that way. And so I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And what that I had attached to the meeting announcement the slide deck that we have, and it's a pretty big slide deck. So I'm not going to be going through every one of the slides, and it's so large because, well, we have 7 communities, and each of them is unique. Each of them has essentially a couple of slides or a series of slides that go with each of the various elements that we want to be talking about this morning. So that slide deck blows up pretty good. But I also wanted to make sure everybody had it so that you can start to use it as kind of a data repository of at least the kind of the parsed out pieces of the work that we're ultimately doing here to kind of get to that position of, okay, here are the locations within each of the communities where we want to be looking at potential countermeasures to address crash issues that may be observed through the crash data analysis that was done, through all of the outreach that's been done to date, but then also at least at a cursory level, looking at some of those risk elements, those risk factors that we see within each of the networks today. And I'm going to be kind of talking about each of those parts. I'm going to be focusing more just on kind of the summaries for each of the communities. If you want to kind of look ahead at some of the mapping for your community and have a question or two, that would be great. But at the same time, if you want to use today, after I explain what each of the elements is, as a starting point of interacting with us a little bit more on outside of these meetings, hey, that would be great too. And we could always spend a little bit more time with you kind of walking through particular parts if you have questions, or if in your community you want to have a little bit more conversation. But so the things I want to cover today are the feedback from the community, each of the community outreach, the crash assessment results that we've done that results in the high injury network that we've been talking about from the beginning. I want to talk about what I'm calling is, or would identify as, the higher risk network elements, and I'll explain what I mean there. And then we can just have or can address any questions that people have. I can address questions along the way that Mark Parrington and with Snyder and his folks have done all of the crash analysis that is the inputs to the high injury network. And we've already started kind of considering in that next steps, what are some of those countermeasures that we can be looking at to address the particular types of crashes that we are seeing. So I'll just stop for a second and see if there's anything anybody wants to bring up quick. Cool. Okay, I've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but when you think think about the three things that we have incorporated into the conversation today, you might be going, well, those three things aren't really necessarily related, but really they are very much interrelated in the idea of our goal here is to come up with what we are calling as our high priority safety network, essentially, that we want to address the crashes and the crash experience that we see within the network. But again, as I've already kind of pointed out a little bit, is part of that equation brings in the community feedback. So in the community survey, we asked people some of their concern areas. We had a mapping exercise. People were able to put information in that way. We also have the high injury network, which is based on all of the crash data that we have looked at from the Iowa DOT. But then we have that element of the high risk network conditions, which are those locations in each of the communities where we are seeing those conditions that create additional risk. Think about from our railroad crossings, they create additional risk. It's one more thing I have to be aware of. In a lot of communities where there may not be a lot of trains, other communities there may be, a lot of regular trains. Each of those situations creates those elevated areas of risk. We also are including in that risk those risk factors of higher speed roads, those roads within the community that are more than 35 miles an hour. We include in there the 4-lane undivided roads, where again, you've got in the inside through lane in those situations, a lot of times, acts more like a left turn lane. So there's constantly people stopping, waiting for a gap in that lane, which again creates a situation where drivers have to, think a little bit more, elevates the risk. Signalized intersections are another location of elevated risk, again, because it's constantly changing in that intersection. And again, with that, there are areas where I have to constantly be aware of, well, something could be different this time that I go through the intersection relative to, a situation where if it's all stop signs, well, I know a stop sign is here. Well, a signal is there. There is the needing to be aware of whether or not it's green for you or not. And we also have identified those areas that are adjacent to the schools in each of the communities, understanding that in those short bursts in the morning, short bursts in the afternoon during the school year, that there is a lot of activity going on. We also have, a lot of younger drivers intermixing with a lot of pedestrians. And so those are also those areas where we would want to make sure that we're looking at them a little bit more detail. So that's one of those other conditions that fall into this high risk condition. So that and here I think I just want to make sure that from this, we can kind of very easily conclude that the work that we're doing here to identify those locations to focus on is not just using crash data. So there are those other elements that tell the remainder of the story, those including the near miss kind of locations that we can gather through the outreach. So this is how each of those various elements is going to work together as we continue through the work here. Okay, any questions? Okay, so let's start with the community outreach, and that with the community outreach that we essentially had two paths, that within each of the communities we spent 2 hours at a tabling event, or a minimum of 2 hours at a tabling event at either a community event that was going on or some other activity that was going on within each of the communities. The list here is those events that we participated in, whether or not it was Atlantic Fest or a farmer's market, National Night Out. We went to 2 of the different communities during that period, and spent some time at sorry. And we spent time in the communities earlier on in the study, gathering information as to what people saw as some issues, but then also making them aware of the community survey that they could complete and provide additional information about their community. We will be, or we have documented, and we have a draft of the tabling events that we had at each of the communities. We will be distributing that to people when we get it all finalized. So the next series of slides here is one of the things that we did at the tabling events was we had a board that looked just like this, and we went through the quintessential planner dot exercise and asked people to provide their input as to which of each of these different conditions that we generally see in communities that are risky, and which are most concerning to them, and so that we have a table or a chart of each of the communities. And here what we're displaying is that for each of the conditions, how many people or how many dots were placed within that particular category, that we gave everybody 4 tape dots. And you can see that we had a much larger number of opportunities there, so that that made people consider how important they really saw each of these, and how they may weigh each of the different categories relative to the others. So we have in the deck here the results from your particular community, from Atlantic to Clarinda, Glenwood and Harlan, Missouri Valley and Red Oak, and then Shenandoah. And again, I'm not going to go through each one, just kind of explain a little bit. But then when we look at the accumulation of each of the communities, that this is how each of those areas, from distracted drivers, speeding, to not enough lighting on certain corridors, more crosswalks in the community, to all of these other different factors, those that were identified at the most as being a concern to people were these 4. Is first, and I think first by a long shot, was the idea of distracted drivers. The second most identified concern was speeding throughout the community, and then the third was people not stopping completely at a stop sign, and one of the, I guess maybe at least from my perspective, one of the more concerning is drivers not yielding for people, or essentially pedestrians in crosswalks or wherever they may encounter people. So this is essentially just a brief summary of the information that we had heard, at least through the tabling exercise. And then also at that tabling exercise, we were distributing postcards that had a QR code so people could access the community survey, and I'll touch on the results of that next. But maybe if there was anybody that is on the meeting today, were you able to participate in any of the tabling exercises, and is there any takeaways that you folks may have? We didn't really talk about this earlier, Rachel or Lindsay or Brandon. Are there any quick elements or ideas that you would want to add from your experience at the tabling events?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that I would like to add. I would say that all of these tables were great. We had a lot of good input and feedback from the community. I think the not stopping at stop signs was probably one of the ones that surprised me the most, that I heard from almost everyone that I talked to. So it was definitely a situation of either rolling stops or people just not stopping at all, or some intersections that didn't even have stop signs that people were concerned about collisions or had seen collisions before. So in terms of stuff that stuck out, I'd say that that was probably the biggest one for me.
Something that stuck out to me across a couple of the communities was that there was a lot of concern. So we were like kind of talking with people about maybe things that weren't on the poster board as an option, and electric scooters came up multiple times in multiple communities, and I thought that was just kind of surprising. I wasn't really expecting that, but I guess the electric scooters have kind of become popular in a lot of these communities, and there's concern about how those scooter riders might not be adhering to stop signs, other traffic laws, things like that, and creating dangerous situations for both themselves and others. It wasn't anything that was like nearly as common as the distracted driving issue, but it was something that I just, initially wasn't expecting to come up really at all. So I do have that kind of documented.
Yeah, and I will just double down on that as well. I heard also a lot about the scooters and kind of also ATVs, four-wheelers, basically any of those motorized vehicles and golf carts that especially younger kids and whatnot are driving around unsupervised without any safety gear on in these communities and on the roadways. So that was definitely a concern.
Anybody else?
Jarvis here, just to add on the scooter and stuff. We have a policy developed here at the city of Harlan, and it's been approved. So we have that in place. So if somebody wants a copy or something just to help to draft their own, I'll be willing to share that.
Cool. Okay. Okay, so that pretty much just a quick summary of what we observed at the tabling exercises. The next thing I wanted to touch on a little bit was the online survey. Is that the survey has been closed, but it was open for probably 6 weeks, approximately, or 4 to 6 weeks.
Yeah,
And what I just
almost 2 full months. I think we opened it around the start of August and then closed it around the end of September.
So I just want to kind of hit on 2 parts of it. Is that, and there were 2 parts in the survey. Is that the first part was just asking questions about areas of concern that people may have within their communities, going back to, again, similar to what we had completed on the tabling. Asked some questions about how people travel around town. And then also asked some questions about, okay, here is a potential list of improvements relative to addressing safety issues. Which of these might you have more preference, more be more interested in considering for your particular community? And so I just want to kind of hit, and then there was also in there the mapping exercise or the mapping activity. People could go into each of their communities and drop a pin into a location. They could also put a comment in. So if there was a specific location where they had concern of people, rolling through stop signs, or concern of, well, here's a signal with no pedestrian accommodation at it, with pedestrian heads or crosswalks or things like that, that they could identify specific locations in their community and note those. And also you'll kind of see that, well, there are also some notes in here that are outside any of the 7 communities that we are working in. And that's the cool thing about this map, is that it's essentially continuous, and that while we're at a lot of these activities that drew people from other communities, and they were saying, well, I don't live here, but there's this concern I have over here. We encouraged them to still go out to the survey and at least take the mapping element of it and drop a pin in, so that we can also document those that are outside the communities, which I think anytime we can make sure that we gather more input, it's going to be critically important.
Yep, and Bill's going to go through a little bit, but I just wanted to note to everyone that this survey is closed in terms of we're not accepting any more responses, but the map and the responses are still available on the website. So if anybody feels like going into the website, this map that's shown here on this slide is still up, and you can still zoom in and click on those individual responses and see kind of what people were saying, in addition to the information that Bill's going to go through in the slides.
Yep. Yeah, and it might actually be better to a certain extent to go out to the map and take a look, because you know, that what it does when we pull it in is it well, it doesn't do the greatest job in the world of connecting the two, where in the map that you look at a particular location, you can see both the button and the comment, which in my head works a lot better. Okay, so I want to go through some of the more basic responses that we've received, and I'm going to be covering just the accumulation of each of all of the communities. In that, in the documentation, we will go in and break out the responses to each of the questions or the responses to the questions for each of the communities, so that you can see for your particular community, you know, that maybe some of the similarities, some of the differences that there may be across across all of the communities that we have. So our initial question really was asking people about how do you travel, and how do you generally get around the community by a particular mode. Do you drive? Do you walk? Do you bike? And people had the ability to answer more than one, or provide more than you know, a response of, well, I drive. And that we essentially asked, how often do you use that particular mode? Is it, you know, essentially every day? Is it you know, half of the week? Is it a couple of times during the week? Is it you know, once during the week? Is it less than weekly, or is it never? And you can see here, which I don't think is going to surprise anybody, that the majority of the most used mode is driving. And you know, I think when we look at the next of people walking, that, you know, this is a pretty nice distribution of how often people walk, even though in all likelihood the bulk of that purpose is for recreation. But there are walkers in the communities, but then that also means that there is pedestrians being exposed to our most prevalent mode, which is driving, which again leads us back to why we're doing studies like this one. And then just kind of, again, down the road here of how often people use each of the modes, you know, including the electric scooter mode that was just brought up. I think, you know, in that you can kind of just see the distribution across each of the particular modes about how frequent people are using each of those. So I'll just see if any questions, anybody? Any surprises? Okay. Okay. This one, I'll start right off. This one surprised me. That one of the questions that, or kind of the combined questions that we asked here are, in the last 5 years, have you either witnessed or been in a crash? And this one surprised me. That, you know, more than about 45% of all of the respondents had either witnessed or been in a crash. And that to me was a pretty high number. You know, just thinking of the last 5 years, and at least in my experience, is I don't think, other than driving past one that had occurred, you know, in the, you know, maybe a half an hour before that, I have not really been in the situation where I would have witnessed or been in a crash. So this one actually surprised me, and I'll ask, does that surprise others? Okay. Also on this one, and this one will be important for us to make sure that we also document is that there are 13 respondents provided a story, a little bit of an explanation of the situation that they were either in or that they observed. And I think that, that is going to be, has the potential to be a pretty powerful element of the documentation that is being put together for the survey. We also, consistent with what we had asked at the tabling exercise, we also gave people the opportunity to essentially provide input on those same elements of which are the most important issues that we need to be addressing relative to safety within the region. And, consistent with what we saw from the surveys or the tabling exercise, the idea of vehicle speed, distracted drivers, and that essentially that compliance with traffic laws kind of relates back to that not stopping at stop signs. That what we're seeing from the survey kind of mirrors what we had observed during the tabling. Which I think, again, just provides us with another point of consistency within the area. So this is, this is the summary from all 7 of the communities. And again, we will do the breakout. And then the next one is the idea of, is there a preference for those safety improvement ideas that we can be looking at over the course of the next phase of the work? The top one here is enforcement of traffic laws, which, I think maybe Mark can back this one up a little bit, but okay, this one always sounds good. And so we elevate the level of enforcement. We go after grants to give us a little bit of money for overtime to elevate the level of enforcement. Works for a little while, but then that we may see an improvement in the level of compliance. But then over the course of time, we do then typically see that degradation of the positive effect associated with that added enforcement. So that's kind of that cyclical thing, which I'm sure you all already understand that one. But okay. Any of the responses on here that anybody wants to touch base on a little bit? In this question, people were also, provided the opportunity of other, didn't have to pick from the list, in that we pulled from the responses to the other category, those elements, their ideas that people may have. Well, I guess we get more enforcement there a little bit more, but the idea of adding sidewalks, a little bit more public transit, considered ADA. I guess we kind of combine those a little bit more with sidewalks to come up with a more holistic response there. Okay. In that, we also provided the opportunity for people to provide input on what they see are the most concerning issues. That we had about 98 responses, or we had 98 responses for this particular question. And we have gone through and accumulated all of those responses into one pile where we weren't really discerning between the mode. And the top 3 out of those 98 responses for concern were visibility, speeding, and again, incomplete sidewalks, gaps in sidewalks along the way for people to walk. But then we also went in and broke it out by the mode that people were using, did a cross-tabulation between what the responses were and the mode that people were primarily using. And visibility, speeding, sidewalks, and sidewalks were essentially also identified by those folks driving and pedestrians. So again, we still see some consistency between some of those responses across modes. We also had a very few responses from people that were bicyclists and their response to the open end, which was considerably different. I suppose to a certain extent, considerably different when you're thinking about no safe place to bike. Is that very much similar to if I'm a pedestrian, if I have gaps in sidewalks, if I have a lack of crosswalks, is that no safe place to walk? So I think we can kind of connect those two a little bit. Okay. Any questions? Any comments, input? Please. Okay. In the exercise, we also, in the mapping exercise, it was also connected to the survey, that the next group of slides here, and I'm just going to explain the results here. But then for each of the communities, we're able to pull down from the survey the locations of each of those pins that were put in, and we essentially had 3 different types of pins. We had one pin for biking, one pin for a driving concern, and another pin for a walking and or rolling concern. And each of them is in a different color. But then, and then for each of them, you had the ability to put a pin in, provide a comment. Some people just put a pin in with no comment. So that just reduces the number of comments, but each of those locations have been recorded, and they will be included in the summaries that we've been putting together. But the key is that you can see that people are providing, a little bit of precision on where they have particular issues as they're traveling about each of their communities. So we have the same result of the mapping from each of the communities, but then we also have a written, essentially a download of where the pin was located, what was the type of pin that was dropped, and what was the verbatim input that we received. So if you want to look at your particular community, you can come back and see all of those results that we've been seeing from the community survey. So we have a set of these for each of the communities that we have within the study area. Some communities with a few more responses than others, and some communities with a little bit more on the detail. Here in Missouri Valley, where we had 3 people dropping in pins that there was not really any additional response to the mapping exercise there. So, I've included this in the slides just so people wouldn't think that, well, did you just forget Missouri Valley? So for each of the communities, is there anything that anybody wants to stop on their community and have a bit of a discussion about? And then I think, but when we get towards the end of the meeting, I would not mind having a bit of a conversation as to, okay, and am I being that complete in the explanation, or are there other things that we could be doing to kind of elevate the level of conversation in the meetings? So somebody could remind me that I want to bring that one up. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is the additional conversation of developing that high priority network, hitting on the high injury network. And this is the network that is essentially based on the crash data that we have downloaded or received from the Iowa DOT database. We have looked at 10 years of crashes within each of the communities. looking at and incorporating into the analysis those crashes that resulted in a fatality, those crashes that were identified as severe, that they would have resulted in an incapacitating injury, and that these essentially are the two groups of crashes in larger metros like a Des Moines, like a Cedar Rapids, like an Omaha, that if you're in those larger communities, that those are the groups of crashes that really go into the high injury network. Understanding that there are fewer of those crashes in smaller communities, it's really tough to do any kind of an analysis or data analysis of the small numbers. So we have then also added on any crash that resulted in a reported injury. It might have just been, well, I got scratched while I was, that crash resulted in me getting a scratch or something like that was actually reported. So we have broadened out the number of years of crash data that we look at, because again, in a larger urban, we're looking at 3 years, we're looking at 5 years where there are a lot more crashes, and we've expanded the severity kind of characteristics that we've included within our grouping. So that, then what do we do with that? We essentially gather all of the information, compile that database. We organize all of that information by severity, again, fatality, serious injury, or severe injury, possible injury, but we do not evaluate those that are property damage only. And then our goal here is to understand the locations within the communities where we see issues. And so that then what we do is attach each of the crashes that we have received from the database with a particular location within the street network. Some of the things that we need to be concerned about is the location is going to come off of the crash report, so that there may be some concerns at some locations about how precise those are, so then that really results in us going back and looking at roadway segments as much as we are particular points along a segment. We group the data into segments, so then we don't have to worry quite as much about the level of precision, and these segments are relatively short, so that it's not a 3-mile segment that we're going to be pushing all of the data together along that length of a segment, whereas there's 20 different changes in the characteristics of the road over a segment of that long. So that then as we group them into segments, it gives us some ability then to attach to a particular location. And then we assess the crashes in each of the corridors, breaking it out and evaluating it by type and severity. So in this part of the analysis, rather than just saying, well, we're going to either come up with a crash rate and use that, or we're going to just use straight number of crashes, that we essentially create an index. And that index takes into account how many crashes of each severity and crashes of a higher severity, so a crash that may result in a fatality. We also put a multiplier effect on those, and that crashes that are less severe, which, hey, they're still important, but we want to make sure that our networks are focusing on those higher injury crashes, or at least elevating the importance of those higher injury crashes in the analysis that we are doing. We also can break them out, or have broken them out by mode. Again, that focusing on those modes such as bicyclists and pedestrians that are the most vulnerable of the populations that travel. We also have those broken out in our high injury network. So then the result of that is, well, then we really need to come up with a definition of the word high. And that's essentially done, well, to a certain extent, using the experience that we have with doing many of these studies, having a pretty good database of how the breakdown of those indices are, or the breakdown of those indices result looking at communities of various sizes, from rural areas and counties to the small urbans that we're working in here to large metros, that we've developed a definition of high, in that in high, essentially high, medium, and low. And those are what we end up mapping in our high injury network. So what the next series of maps here, and why I put these side by side, is that the map on the, well, I probably should have labeled those. The map on the left is our high injury network, and in this case, it's for Atlantic. And I always like to be able to look at what are we defining as high injury, and what's the data set show that we're using. Because we would anticipate, we would hope, we would expect that there should be a relationship. In that when we're looking at Atlantic, you can see that, yep, there is a relationship between not only the density or the number of crashes, but also where are those more severe crashes occurring. Here we have, and also those that involve the vulnerable populations, the pedestrians and the bicyclists. When you're looking at the roadway corridor down here, and you can see that in there that we have had at least a suspected serious injury, but we've also had at least one crash that involved a non-motorist, which again, those two conditions are going to be elevated in the index analysis that's done. So I guess it's so that what we have here is the results for each of the communities, from Atlantic to Clarinda. You can kind of see here that there is much less mileage within the high injury network, even though we have had a fatality outside of that high injury network. This is somewhat a result of, well, we're not really seeing all that many crashes in the first place, so that there's only so much indexing you can do with a relatively low number of crashes. And Glenwood, you kind of look at the data set over here for Glenwood, and if I remember right, over the 10-year period, there was something like 19 reported crashes in Glenwood. So you kind of compare that 19 to what is occurring in some of the other communities, and in my head, there would not be an expectation of a substantial high injury network when there really isn't a large number of crashes of any severity occurring within the community. Rachel, you came on. Did you want to add anything? Okay. And then Harlan, again, the data that we see of where there may be some concentrations, to me reflects well with what we're including in the network. Missouri Valley, here with the idea that you're coming right off of the interstate, coming through town. But again, you can kind of see that relationship between the data set of where crashes and those more severe, or those crashes that are involving pedestrians or bicyclists occur, does reflect what we're coming back to on the high injury network. Red Oak and Shenandoah. And okay, so again, that you have each of the communities in the packet, and I know you just got these, And so if you want to take a little bit of time outside of this meeting and kind of look at it, and then if you have any questions, you can give me a call, send me an email, and we can have a conversation about any question that you may have relative to what we have come up with for the high injury networks. Is there anything immediate that anybody wants to bring up?
So the only thing I'm going to say is that so these high injury networks are great tools, and they're kind of what we use to get to our next step of that countermeasure and priority project list. So this is kind of how we start off that conversation with identifying where we need to be looking. So as Bill said, they'll be out in the packet, and you guys can take a look at those and let us know if this kind of tracks with what you're seeing, or if you have any other concerns and things like that.
And I think actually, you know, thinking back to some of the summaries that I looked at from Shenandoah, but I think there were also a considerable number of comments of the condition over on the west side of town here. So I think what we're seeing probably tracks pretty well with perception. So, you know, I said at the beginning that, okay, that crash data is not the end all be all on our identification of those locations where we have we want to be focusing any assessment of countermeasures. The other, and you know, we've already talked about the input that we received through the community survey, talked a little bit about the data. Now the last part is that high risk network. So those system or those locations in the system where we see what we have defined as this very cursory set of higher risk conditions. Again, where there are railroad crossings, where there are higher speeds, where there are 4-lane undivided roadways, where signals are located, and those areas adjacent to schools. So, hey, there it again. Hey, what do you know? I already have it in another. I've already went through the list. So that what we have also done is for each of the communities is gone in and mapped, and I'll tell you right now, these maps are in a draft stage, but we have gone in and mapped each of the locations where, again, we see higher speeds, where we see arterials that don't have sidewalks on them, where we are adjacent to schools, where we have signalized intersections, where we have signalized intersections that don't have pedestrian accommodation, where we have at-grade railroad crossings. So each of the communities, there's a map attached with the packet that you have. That again, the information in these maps will also be an element to direct us to where we want to be identifying the high priority network to address issues that we see. And that I think the interesting thing that I kind of took away as you're kind of putting these together and looking at each of the communities is kind of the mix of elements. You know, here in Atlantic, there's a little bit of a smorgasbord. There's a number of different conditions that we see. Where in Clarinda, it's a little bit more limited, but you know, we have a whole lot of higher speed corridor within the community, or at least within the city limits of the community, even though it's kind of on the fringe. Glenwood, you know, the characteristics there in Harlan. And Missouri Valley here, I think one of those, you know, very, I'll call it interesting things is that the lack of pedestrian accommodation and the signals as we're looking through the Highway 30 corridor going through town, and a number of, you know, very significant railroad crossings. And then Red Oak, and ultimately Shenandoah. Okay, I'll stop a second, see if there's anything that people want to have a conversation about. Again, these are draft. If you look at, and we will continue to back check things. But if you see inconsistencies or things that you want to make sure we get mapped, please send, just mark up the map that's in, or a map, and let us know. Anything? Okay. Wow, that went fast. That went fast. So, okay, what are we going to do with all of the information that, that essentially each of the elements that we had talked about essentially gets layered through the continued GIS analysis, and those locations where we received feedback from people of areas of a concern. Those locations where out of the crash data analysis where we saw higher indices of crashes, taking into account number and severity. Then also layered in those locations where we're seeing these higher risk factors or higher risk elements, layering each of those and ultimately coming up with a composite. So that ultimately what you're going to see out of this is that I'm just going to kind of come back here to the high injury network, and I like the idea that we have the example in Glenwood, where there is, just evaluating straight crash data, we're not seeing elements of a high injury network. But we do have responses from people in Glenwood of areas of concern. So those get incorporated into the analysis and get carried forward, even though we're not seeing densities of crashes that are more severe that would elevate themselves to be on the high injury network. And then if I go back down to those risk factors and come again to Glenwood, again, we have identified elements within the community that will help us, identify locations where we'd be looking at potential countermeasures to address not only the crashes, but maybe these risk factors that we have, which we can connect to certain types of crashes being a little bit more prevalent in those situations. So that is the process that we are in now, that will then lead us to then identifying countermeasures that are proven through research to address those issues and areas of concern that we've identified through the three means that we had a lot of conversation about today. And that then we will go through and test and screen those countermeasures. And that then for each of the communities, the idea would be then first coming up with a package of potential countermeasures that would be effective against the high priority issues, high priority network concerns that we see within each of the communities, but then also put together cost estimates associated with implementing them, and then bring that draft back to the committee, and then go through a process of screening those to make sure that we're focusing on not only what the data is telling us as locations where we should be considering improvement to the network, modification to the network, programs that would help improve driver behavior, pedestrian behavior. But then we're also making sure that we have that community perspective. And when we're looking at countermeasures, that we have a series of potentials that we can look at based on the location, based on the mode of travel, and not only those things that are more capital intensive as we're looking over here, but there are also packages of those elements that focus more on education, focus on enforcement, as we're evaluating or within the range of ideas that we can potentially advocate for the area. And then, associated with this, then this also then will be a set of opportunities for funding, not only through the SS4A program, but then there's the Iowa DOT safety program that there's funding that I think we even said at the first meeting is that the situations that we're going to look at here are very consistent with those kinds of projects that are currently in the TIP or the STIP to be funded through that particular program. And, we were not expecting that we would come up with, a marginally different list of potential needs across the communities that focus on the crashes and those areas of concern that we see. So this kind of establishes the baseline of those countermeasures that we can be looking at across the entire region. Okay. And I think that was it of the things that I wanted to cover today. Are there questions? Are there things that people want to have a conversation about relative to the information that was presented here? Mark Harrington, you raised your hand, or did you just kind of hit a button by mistake? Okay, now let's take this a little bit different direction. Okay, is the format that we're using in these meetings worthwhile for you? Or is there something that we should be doing differently? I mean, other than making sure you have the data in advance. But I think this one anyway, it needed the explanation to go with the pieces parts to be real useful to you.
Yeah, and I will say a lot of what we've been doing so far is kind of trying to make sure that you guys are included in the process of developing this plan, and getting kind of all of the updates, the information as we're going forward. But we are also hoping to get some feedback from y'all to see if you think we're on the right track, if there's other things you think that we might be missing, and stuff like that as we're kind of going through this process. So I guess that's kind of what we're opening the floor up for now, is to get some of that feedback. Did the information that was presented today make sense? Is there more you would like to see? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, Jarvis here. I just want to see more of the analysis part of it, to have that based on weather too, season, to get more information on that based on winter, summer, fall, spring, and be able to identify those high risk areas.
Okay. Okay.
Are you thinking it'd be kind of more crashes like during the winter season, or just wanting to see seasonality plays a role?
I mean, if you can do based on the winter season, summer, spring, fall, and just put that together, so we can identify those and get the true analysis and report based on that. Okay, in the winter time, these areas there's high chance of accident. Oh, this is the areas where there's low accident, and just kind of identify that way. So when we do the implementation on the project, we know exactly what the focus will be.
Okay. Now, I think focusing that on the crash data, I think is worthwhile, but it doesn't necessarily carry through to that high injury network, simply based on how that, well, you're going to really reduce your data set if we separate it out by season. But are you okay if what's shown is the crash data map, the data points, and breaking those out by a combination of severity and season? Maybe one symbol for severity and a color for the season.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. That to me is I believe something that would not be all that difficult to do, but I'm okay. I'll just leave
Yeah,
it at that.
And I'm thinking of something like that doesn't even necessarily need to be mapped. I don't think it might just be if we're able to look at all of the crashes and say, of all of these crashes, like what is the seasonality of those crashes? And is there a trend towards a higher crash rate at different times of year or not, basically? So.
And that will help to create the measure on that and see, okay, is it because the air is sloping down and the traffic light is there? What we need to do different to eliminate those accidents?
Yeah, and I know there were some comments we got from the survey where people were having concern, especially with intersections that were at the bottom of hills.
Yes.
So we had some feedback from people who drive like heavy load trucks, and they're coming down to those intersections, and it's hard to slow down, and then people kind of blast through the stop sign, and that was one thing that came up a few times in the survey. And I can imagine that only being exacerbated in the winter. So.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
Have you incorporated time of year or essentially the date into the dashboard? And where I'm going with that is
Yeah.
Jarvis, in the dashboard that we've developed, would that almost be a more useful tool than us just, creating, okay, the dashboard is still going to be the same static data, but well, you can look at it a lot quicker. And then if you have this little twist that you would like to also add, can you then click another button and have the data set update to what you're looking for there? I mean, have you looked at or spent much time on the dashboard? How about if we just zoom in Harlan there?
Sure. Yeah, I think certainly there's an opportunity there. We could do some things. I know there's a pavement condition field pending if the officer was able to note certain conditions. We certainly have date without a doubt. So, and I'm trying to think if there's a contributing cause that's actually icy pavement. I think that's the surface conditions. But there is a potential there of something, one could do where you could sort on it. It always just has in my history of doing, looking at safety analysis, what's always tough with roadway conditions is just so many things of how do storms move in? When do they hit? Middle of the night? Do they hit during the day? When is traffic? What were the pavement temperature in relation to it icing up versus slushy and sloppy if you're talking about snow? There's a lot of randomness in there. There's certainly some other events at times you worry about with, fog and things that could be environmental conditions of nearby elements. So there's a lot of different things we can think about it. But Bill, yeah, I mean, this dashboard, we can, if there's a data field for it, we can make it part of it without a doubt, or you could look at it.
Well, okay, Jarvis, if we simply added a button here that would be, spring, winter, summer, and fall, would that get you to a point where it would answer the question that you have?
It will be helpful just to
Okay.
know, the timing and stuff like that. So if there's any projects you're looking to do,
Yeah.
You can determine the elevation on the area and things like that. Yeah.
I imagine there's an opportunity here on the screen I'm showing of maybe not so much you select it, but it could just be another tab you select, like what was the speed limit of the roadways where the crashes occurred. And again, let me just play with this a little bit. Go fatal, go serious. And you say, oh, okay, here's where the things are occurring. What are the speeds of the roads on which these crashes occurred? There could be another one that would be built what you were alluding to. You know, we could do it by month, by quartiles of kind of months or
Right.
something of what we'd call the typical winter season, a typical, you know, spring, summer, typical fall. Because I mean, certainly there's other things of the sun angle when we start talking spring or fall that can, you know, east-west roads can be troublesome as you approach an intersection, trying to see a traffic signal and you got the sun sitting right behind it, you know, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, so I think that if we would just kind of, if we could add, you know, an additional element there of this spring, summer, fall, winter. And
Okay.
I mean, if everybody's cool, we just go with, you know, the calendar definition of those.
About the other thing we could do too is just like where we talk about, well, was it an intersection or a segment of roadway? I can look into that surface condition. How many times did something occur on a reported icy? Again, not going to be surprised if you get some of that because somebody loses control of the vehicle on an icy road. So then, yeah, it really becomes a question of, is there a different maintenance practice or something that could make a difference? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would be a little concerned about breaking it down that discreetly because how much of that then comes back to, well, it started to snow at midnight. And that's when, you know, the crashes occurred and there just wasn't enough ability to get snowplows out there for treatment and those things that I think we're getting too discreet in a particular event.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I was gonna say, I think what it boils down to is there's definitely a worthwhile exercise here to take all of the data and look at the seasonality of that data and see if there's a trend. I don't necessarily think we need to jump straight into mapping everything. I think the first step is definitely to see if there is a trend and if the weather and the seasonality is impacting things. And then if we see that it is a strong impact, then we can look at maybe mapping that out in a bit more detail. But I think that's probably the first step we're going to want to take for that.
Yeah. And what I would do is take the whole data set, the 7 community data set to start. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Anything else that people want to bring up? Anything that you would want to see the meetings include? And maybe going forward, they're a little bit more, I don't know, interesting in that there we'll be talking about actions as opposed to, you know, here's the whole big old pile of data and here's all the stuff we've done to it.
Yeah, so Jervis, you did mention that you guys have developed some policies on scooters, is that right?
Yes.
Would you be able to send that to us so we can kind of take a look at it and make sure that kind of stuff gets incorporated as well? I think
definitely.
that would for us to have in here.
Yeah, I'll be able to share that. Yeah, I'll send it to you.
Thank you.
And then I know that we did get emails from county engineers who have or county supervisors who have their board meetings in this time slot. I know our next meeting we are currently planning, I think, is for January 13th, which is another Tuesday that would be kind of in this slot again. But in the interest of kind of making sure that more people are able to attend these meetings, Bill, I don't know if it's worthwhile sending out a doodle poll to a group this big. But we might be able to send out some kind of survey with a couple of meetings slot options for January, just to make sure that we're getting as much participation as we can.
Okay. Yeah, we can.
Another question, Bill, for you is I'm looking for the future plan with this project. What we're doing now is the funding opportunities too, you know, down the road, if we can be able to identify those and go from there.
We will document in it the range of federal grant programs, state grant programs that align with the kinds of actions that we would be including for each of the communities.
Perfect.
Yeah, and Travis Hom had to duck out around 11. He was on for the first half hour of this meeting. He's actually been put on a task force at the DOT to kind of help identify funding opportunities for safety projects specifically. So fingers crossed that with work like this, that will kind of help be able to influence that a little bit too. So.
Okay. Anything else? Okay. Well, I thank you for your time, and I'll send out. I'll just send it. I'll set up a 2-question poll. I think that'd be better than the doodle poll, as you thought, Lindsay. So I'll get that put together quick and send it out to the group, asking, is there a time slot? Is there a day of the week that you would prefer? Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
And the slides and recording things will go up on the website pretty soon here too. So we'll make sure to get that posted so that people have the materials available, and if anybody wasn't able to attend, we can make sure that they get the resources as well.